You are watching Lesson 9 for beginning students of the Dance of the Eye and the Hand. Today, we will be painting a mountain with dots.
Hello there, welcome back. Today, we're going to do a complete landscape. This will be a mountain with foreground of some pine trees, mountain with outline and shading and wash, and we'll do dots on the mountain, and I'll explain that in a little bit. And then we will put a date on it and have our first complete landscape. This is our 9th out of 10 beginning lessons. Next time, the 10th one will be a complete piece of calligraphy, a couplet, and again, dating it so that you have a complete piece. So let's get started. I have my paper square in front of me, tall-wise. I'm sitting square to the table, the paper is square to me. I may put my feet on the floor to get a good grounding. I'm going to look at my model, and part of the task with this model is to use your imagination. We're going to try and, with our minds, remove all the dots, remove all the shading, to try and see what's underneath. In process, we'll start in this lower right corner with this set of pine trees. Then we'll move on to doing the outline, then some shading lines, a little bit of wash, and then lastly the dots, which I'll explain in more detail when we get to that point. So let's start with these in the corner with these pine trees. I have a fresh brush. I get it wet in my water. I use a mixing dish to make my point. Maybe take a little bit of that excess off, pick up some ink from my stone and work it into the brush. And I can take my time doing this, using that time to look at the model and look at either what's under those dots or just focus on those trees and which tree do we start with, which tree is next, which tree comes after that. We'd start, this is a more advanced concept, but the concept is that of host and guest, and we'd start with the tree that is the main tree or the host tree. And looking at this, I would say this is the host, this is the first guest, the second guest, the third, and the fourth. So as in other things relative to Chinese painting, there is a process or sequence to put these things in, and part of it is creating hierarchies like host and guest. So I have some ink on my brush. I don't want it too wet, but I do want it black. This needs to be the darkest, blackest ink on the painting. I'll start down here in this corner and make that first branching or first trunk. Comes down and goes boldly off the page. Always go boldly off the page. Then it has a couple of branches, one longer, a couple coming down this way, out. Then I'm going to add my needles, which in this case are simply dots, wet dots. They don't need to be the same size, but they do need to overlap. So I'll take my time and just do a little parade, some a little taller, some a little less tall. And really pressing so that they do overlap, so that when it dries, they'll have a strong connection. If you put them apart when they're wet, when they dry, they'll be too far apart, and we don't want that. And then one more, and a couple of other dots on the way. Then I'll start with my next tree. This trunk comes down fairly close to that first one, not quite as tall, has a couple of branches, coming down and crossing that, and a couple coming over, looking like they're hanging over the cliff. And then add my dots to those branches. They can start out a little thicker and then get a little thinner. And I hear a dog nearby that wants to go out, so I'm going to finish this tree and then let the dog out, and then I'll come back to you. Another one. Okay, let me let the dog out. I'll be right back. So now we'll continue with the next tree. Our third tree is down here, and again I'm boldly going off the page, drawing in my simple branches, and then adding my dots. Some of these might have 2 layers of dots, some only 1. And you want to look back and make any corrections if it needs it, just to make it more complete and a little more interesting. Then I have one tree here that's almost hidden. Doesn't seem to have many branches, but is still important to make the group. And then my last tree right here on the edge, again, boldly going off the page. There's no margin or border around a Chinese painting, and what that does in effect is make the piece look bigger. Your mind completes the picture and extends it farther than what is on the page. Again, adding these dots and pressing as I do it. I want them to be wet, they're not dry dots, and I want them to overlap. So I've done my little corner here. Now I'm going to make 3 washes, and I'm going to put some water in 3 different bowls. And what I'm going to do is, in the first one, wash my brush out. And then wick off some of that water, and then wash it out in the second bowl. Wick off that water and wash it off in the third bowl. Now, with my test sheet, what I'm going to do is to dry the brush off, try the first one, make a line, dry it off again, pick up the second one, make a second line, and then the third, make a third line. And if I've done this well, and I think I have dark, lighter, lightest. And I've made 3 tones of wash. You can do this in one bowl by just adding more water as you go, but if you have 3, then you know, this is my lightest, this is my middle, this is my darkest. So now we're going to do the outlines for the mountain, and I'm going to start with my darkest ink, or darkest wash. It's not ink, it's just a dark gray. Dry it off a little bit because I don't want this too wet. I'm looking back at my model and seeing, oh, the first area to the front has this outline like this, and then another one coming over this way. And then inside that is another outline. And again, as we did last time, making mountain outlines, they're strong lines. I use more of the side of the brush, and I want to come straight at myself, lifting so that it disappears into the mist. Now there's another peak over here, left side, then right side, and this comes down a little bit farther. And then one in back, that's the highest one. So swoop and down again. And then one right here on the edge of the page that goes off. Then over here I have a smaller shape, a little bit of an angle down to right, and another smaller shape a little bit of an angle down to right. And those are my outlines. I'm going to do a little bit of shading line and still with that dark gray, but drying the brush off. And I'm just going to add some shading lines here, a little bit too dry there. And there's not a lot of them, but they come down near the bottom. And some of them are going almost to the bottom of the page, but these are just some shading lines. And behind this tree, I'm going to pull some of these back there so that it shows that the tree is in front. And just a few up here, a few here. So it's not as much shading as we did in other pieces, but just enough to give it some height. Now I'm going to do some wash, and the wash I'm going to start with is the middle color. Dry it off just a little bit. I'm going to do these distant mountains, and I'm going to use really the side of the brush. I want to do this in as few strokes as I can, so I don't show that many lines. And this comes down, this hugs that corner. So there are those distant mountains. Then there's some more over here, and these are a little bit darker. So I start with the dark ones right over here, just pressing as I go, running along that outline. Another pressing as I go, a little bit longer. This one a little bit taller and down. And then I'm going to go lighter and pull this down a little farther with a lighter color, or even lighter still. And down here, just a couple of swipes. So now I've done my grays. I'm going to stay with that lighter tone, dry it off a bit, and just do a little bit of shading down here, close to the trees, just to add a little bit of contrast. And this can again go behind those trees, just kind of scraping it. It's not a full wash. And then down at the base, just some very light dots to sort of give a ground line to those trees. I'm going to put a few dots in behind just to thicken it up a bit. Okay, now we're ready to move on to dots. And what I would suggest is you turn the tape off and let this dry for a few minutes, and then come back when the painting is dry, and then we'll add the dots. So now that your painting is dry, we're going to move on to doing the dots. And dots are, let me put some fresh ink on my brush. Dots are just taking the brush and pressing. So it's not a circle dot like when we did leaves. They were just holding it up and letting it make a circle. This is a little more on the side and just making a little smudge, if you will, but planting it, not just over the top, but letting it bleed a little bit. So this is how that looks. And we're going to start with, look at our model, with the darkest, the full ink, and then work to gray, to lighter gray, to lighter gray, and then end with another round of dark ones. And we're going to start primarily at the peak of each shape and just start planting a little cluster of black dots. And we don't want to do anything that has too much of a pattern or rows or columns to it, but just kind of spaced around. Some of them can be above, some of them can be below the outline. And these can be read as, this could be trees, it could be moss, it could be any number of things, but its primary function is energetic. It's to add a little burst of energy to the painting. And part of this concept, we already talked about host and guest with those trees. Now we're going to talk about gathered and scattered. So some of these dots are gathered at points. Some of them are much more scattered, like you threw them over the edge. Just singular points going down. They can get smaller as they come down. So I'm clustering towards the top, creating some groups, and then letting them spill downward down the side of the mountain. And so I'm just reinforcing my outlines with these dots. And you can work a little bit slower. I'm trying to do this so that it doesn't take all day for you to watch this lesson, but just a few dots just scattered down the side, just to help reinforce the composition of the painting. So that's our first layer of dots. Then I'm going to dry my brush and pick up some of that dark gray that we made earlier. Now this is a dark gray, and I'm going to go back again and add some between that to thicken up the groups and the massing of the dots. And not too many, although some of these do connect. So we start connecting groups a bit. And I can vary my pressure, sometimes a little harder, sometimes a little less. Connect a couple of groups here. Make a connection up to here, get a little more gray. Some can go above, some below, making it a little bit thicker, increasing my density. Dry this off a bit. And some more over here. And if you're not getting enough of a contrast between the black and the dark gray, you could add a little bit of water to it or go to your next level. This is the medium gray. There I can see more of a contrast. But I'm just adding some density to it. They don't all have to be connected, particularly with some of the lighter ones. They can be like they're jumping off. And even the lighter ones can come farther down the page. And then I thicken as I go back up. And so we're doing this by layers, and this is what we would call ink accumulation. Now I'm going to dry my brush again and go to my lightest color. And if your color just keeps getting darker as you go, no matter what you load it with, then you might want to wash your brush and start fresh. So here is the lightest color, lightest gray. And some of them are going beyond, some of them are going into it to make it a little bit thicker. And here I can also make some more connectors between the groups. And what we're doing is, in some ways, obscuring our outlines, or another way of putting that is reinforcing the structure so that the structure becomes stronger by the addition of these dots. It also just adds a very almost electric sort of energy to it. They do add a charge, and particularly if you're just giving a nice little burst of energy to each and every dot, it will energize the painting and make it vibrate and be alive. And that's this kind of Chinese painting at its best. Again, just some scattered ones coming down. These are not even attached to the outlines. Coming back up, thickening this out a bit, making a connection. This is coming farther off the edge of the cliff, like they're jumping. So it can be thought of something like, jumping beans. But it adds a vibration. And the farther down, the sort of smaller they get. Here we have a whole bunch of them down here, very light. So think of little balls of fluff going off the edge of the mountain. And they can kind of tie into these trees here. And then my last time around, I'm going to go back to the full black, and I'll add what we can call show-off dots. And those I'm going to take a little more care to just really put some good pressure and energy through, a little more thought, a little more emphasis, almost explosive sort of energy to it. And then lastly, if you look real closely at the model, there are still a couple more trees down in this lower right corner that are really quite faint. And so I'm using my middle gray and light gray. And this I could take a little bit of that ink out because I don't want this to be too wet, and just do a couple more pines that are sort of mid height here. And then I have my painting done. And then I think over here I'll add today's date. So I'll start, I have a nice column right here. I can start up here. 2, 0, 2, 0. Then my character for year, down the left dot, horizontal, second horizontal, another dot, another horizontal, and then vertical. And we're now in 8th month, so we start with character for 8, which we learned last lesson, followed by the character for month. Left vertical, horizontal connects to vertical, horizontal, horizontal. And I'll let you figure out what the exact day is. You can refer back to the last lesson, and then I'll add my name here so it's a complete landscape. And there we are. Mountains, pine trees, distant mountains with dots. Let's give that a try.
Before you go, one last note. The handouts for the Dance of the Eye and the Hand for beginning students and continuing students, all lessons are posted as downloadable PDFs at www.laughingwatersstudio.com. Have a good day. You have been watching Distance Learning from Laughing Waters Studio.